The Flight of the White Stallions, also known as Miracle of the White Stallions, is certainly a really fascinating film. This is a film I'd never heard of, but I discovered it in my mission to watch every Disney feature film. And initially I wasn't sure if I'd like it based on the brief description that I read about it, but I have to say I found it to be very informative and very educational. I don't know exactly how true it is. If anybody knows how factually accurate it is, please feel free to share that information. I'm taking everything with a pinch of salt. I will say it didn't sustain my attention fully. It's quite a long film, and I feel like it's not the most interesting throughout it, but because I found the subject matter to be quite interesting, it was enough to keep me watching. This was released in 1963, directed by Arthur Hiller, and tells the story of the Lifesaner Stallions in Vienna. And it's all about the risk of these horses during the Second World War and the threat that these horses may be no more. Now, I'd never heard of these Lifesaner Stallions before, in general or in Vienna, and they're actually very famous. They're these great symbols. And actually, I found that educational aspect to be really informative and really enlightening. And it also gives some really interesting context about people's attitudes during the war. I don't want to spoil it too much, but for example, it was requested that these stallions were evacuated. And they were told that we can't evacuate those stallions because if people see us evacuating the stallions, it could instill fear that there's no real hope. You know, if you evacuate the stallions, it's kind of saying, oh well, we expect to be horrifically bombed and we expect their lives to be in danger, so we're going to evacuate them. And I thought that was a really interesting point, that doing something like evacuating horses would actually make people think that they have no hope in winning the war. And there are various other, things throughout this that give really interesting perspectives about how people would respond to things, and obviously the main focus is the fate of these horses and what's going to happen to them, and various untruths that people need to tell in order to try and save these horses, which I think is really interesting. But the horse aspect to me I found interesting from an educational perspective, but I was more interested in the other representations of the war. Whenever the sirens went off, it was, I have to say, the sound mixing is really good. It was not so loud that it felt painful to listen to. There are some war films that have the volume for everything at one level, and then the sirens are just at an increasingly obnoxiously loud level, and obviously it's atmospheric, but it hurts, especially if you're listening to earphones or listening with headphones. And I have to say the sound in this is actually really well balanced. But just having all of these different attitudes, these different perspectives, and for me, when I'm like a lot of people really fascinated by the Second World War, I find that this is a very different perspective to the kind of war films that I normally watch. So if, like me, you tend to watch films that are either about, Britain during the war, or maybe Nazi Germany, this is definitely a slightly different angle, with some, different perspectives, and I think it's really fascinating. As I said, it's a bit long. It didn't completely hold my attention. None of the characters really stood out to me as being overly interesting or that fascinating. Not that they were boring. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the performances. I just wasn't emotionally invested in any of this film, and that's me speaking as an animal lover. I don't want to say I wasn't concerned about the horses, but because especially when we see the horses acting in distress when the sirens are going off, that's not something I ever thought about before. How would animals respond to these sirens and and the bombs and things? It's definitely given me a lot of food for thought with these very different perspectives, and I completely have to praise the film for doing that. But as I said, I wasn't really emotionally invested in anybody's particular journey, and I think that's maybe why the longer length dragged a bit for me, because certain scenes that were more character driven didn't interest me that much. But I don't know if that's the fault of the film or just which characters I've taken an interest in, or lack thereof. But either way, I didn't know how I'd feel about this film, but I'm pleased I've had a reason to watch it. The Flight of the White Stallions, or Miracle of the White Stallions, is, from my perspective, educational, informative, definitely different to the war films I usually watch, and one that I would recommend.